guys, my name is Chloe. I am your archaeological guide for day 3 of your VBS. So today we have a lot of super fun stuff to uncover and talk about. But first, let's do our Bible verse for this week. The Bible verse for this week is, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all of your heart." And that's in Jeremiah 29:13. So let's review a little bit what you've learned so far. So on day 1, we talked about Jesus coming as God told us he would, and that he was born in a little town called Bethlehem in a manger. And on day 2 of the dig, we unearthed that Jesus showed God's power, and he did this by healing a blind man with some mud that he had made from his spit. Isn't that really, really cool? So today we are going to be learning about how Jesus was betrayed and experienced rejection like a lot of us do now in a town called Jerusalem, which is where he experienced all this. Jerusalem is going to be right here on our map. But before we get into our story, we are going to talk a little bit about archaeology and what they do. So we know that archaeologists dig stuff up and find old objects, but we often think about them as finding like pots and scrolls and rocks. But did you know they found like regular things too, like shoes? They found in a site in England over 7,000 pairs of leather shoes. Just think years from now, someone might run across your shoes and imagine what it was like to live now. So these are the kind of shoes that people found in England over 7,000 years ago. Like that. And then these were fancier, like that. Leather has been a super important element of archaeological discovery because it teaches us about the fashion, the military equipment, and other things that people used it for. And it teaches us about the way people lived. So today we are going to use this leather strap to visualize our story. And if you have a piece of string or something nearby, you can do this with me as I tell the story. So every time I say something that I think is important, I'm going to tie a knot in my leather. And then at the end, we're going to use that to review. And I'll tell you when I'm tying the knot. So just remember when I mention that. Jesus spent years teaching people about God and doing miracles that proved who he was. Finally, the time came when Jesus knew he was about to take the punishment for all of our sins. He shared one last special supper with his disciples, and during the meal, Jesus taught his disciples about serving others. So, how did Jesus show the disciples how to serve? By washing his disciples' feet. That's right. Their feet were dusty and gross after walking all day in their leather sandals. So we are going to tie a knot to remember that even though Jesus is God, he still served his disciples. Jesus also explained that one of the men who was sharing his bread would betray him. The disciples looked at each other who wondered who he was talking about. Jesus knew that his betrayal and death would fulfill the plans that God had told prophets long ago. After they had eaten, Judas left. He was the one who had betrayed Jesus by telling the authorities where Jesus was. So Judas was paid to betray Jesus. His money may have been tied up in a little leather bag. We're going to make another knot in the leather to remember that Judas betrayed Jesus just like the prophets said he would. Jesus had done nothing wrong. The chief priests and the Pharisees didn't like the things Jesus was telling people about God because they thought that they were the spiritual authorities. After supper, Jesus left with his disciples who remained and walked to the garden in Gethsemane. While they were there, Judas brought the soldiers and the chief priests to the garden. The soldiers may have been carrying the swords and leather scabbards, which are like these little pouches, like the one they found in this very city a few years ago. So we're going to tie another knot to remember that Jesus was arrested. The soldiers arrested Jesus, took Jesus to the former high priest, Annas, and the long night of trials began. Annas listened to the charges, then sent Jesus and his accusers to the current high priest. After Caiaphas heard the charges, he sent Jesus to the Roman governor. By this time, it was very early in the morning. Pilate, the governor, came out to listen to the charges, but the Jewish leaders wanted Jesus killed. Only the Romans could carry out such a drastic form of punishment. Pilate tried to find a way to release Jesus. He even had Jesus beaten and then brought to the crowd to see if that was enough. And the Roman soldiers beat Jesus with a leather whip. So we're going to tie another knot to remember that Jesus was beaten. But the people shouted, "Crucify him." At one point, Pilate asked Jesus a question, but Jesus remained silent, just like the prophecy in Isaiah said he would. Finally, Pilate gave in to the people's demands, and Jesus was given to the soldiers to be crucified. So before we go any further, it's really important that we talk about the moment of silence. With every step that Jesus took that night, he knew exactly what was going to happen. Jesus knows everything that is ever going to happen. And even though he knew that he had done nothing wrong, he didn't argue with Caiaphas when he walked up those steps to stand before him. Instead, he stood silent, just like the prophet Isaiah had written hundreds of years earlier. So we're going to take a few seconds to be silent and just imagine how hard that was. Even though Jesus knew he had done nothing wrong, he had to stay silent. Okay, I don't know about y'all, but it's really hard for me to stay silent. So just think about how difficult that was. Now, we are going to go back and review with our leather what happened in our story. So the first knot, do you remember what it was? Yes, it was that even though Jesus is God, he served his disciples. So we should too. Our second knot was that to remind us that Judas had betrayed Jesus just like the prophet said he would. The third knot, do you remember what it was for? Yeah, this was because Jesus was arrested. And then our final knot, this was to remind us that Jesus was beat for crimes he didn't commit. Okay, and now to talk about a little bit about more archaeology. So these are the actual steps that Jesus would have taken to Caiaphas' house. These are the steps that Jesus would have taken to Caiaphas' house. So this is really cool. You can see how kind of old they are. And just to kind of do one more review, I wanted to show y'all these steps, and then we're going to talk about our story on steps that I made. So the first thing that happened in our story, Jesus shared one last supper with his disciples, and that's where he washed their feet. Then Judas left and was paid to betray Jesus. Then Jesus and his disciples walked to the Garden of Gethsemane. The soldiers came and arrested Jesus. Pilate had Jesus beaten to satisfy the crowd. Jesus stayed silent. And finally, Jesus was given to the soldiers to be crucified. So that was our story for today. So now we're going to talk about some review questions. So, what would be another good word for disciple? What were Jesus and his disciples doing together before he was taken? How did Jesus show his love to his disciples? Jesus showed us how to do what for other people? And then finish this statement. Jesus showed us how to what others? Okay, guys. So that was day 3 of our archaeological dig. I'm so glad you guys joined us. And don't forget to go online and answer our review questions. And we will see you tomorrow at day 4 of the dig. Bye, guys.